Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Internet Protocol Address, which is also known as IP address. Before we begin, I want you all to take a minute and check about your IP addresses on your respective browsers. I hope you all have done it. So let's begin. So what is an IP address? An IP address are 32-bit long numbers made up of 4 octets, and each octet is normally described in decimal numbers. For example, 12.34.556.78 is a right IP address, whereas 123.456.789.100 is not, because it has numbers larger than it could be represented by 8 bits. The important thing to know for now is that IP addresses are distributed in large sections to various organizations and the companies instead of being determined by hardware vendors. This means that IP addresses are more hierarchical and easy to store data about than physical addresses are. Think of IBM, which owns every single IP that has 9 as the first octet. At a very high level, this means if the internet router needs to figure out where to send a data packet intended for the IP address 9.0.0.1, the router only has to know to get it to one of the IBM router. The router can handle the rest of the delivery process from here. It's important to call out that the IP address belongs to the network and not the device attached to the network. So your laptop will always have the same MAC address no matter where you use it, but it will have different IP address assigned to it at an internet cafe than it would at home. For now, remember that on any modern networks, you can connect a device and an IP address will be assigned to it automatically through a technology known as Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. An IP address assigned this way is known as dynamic IP address. The opposite of dynamic is static. Therefore, the static IP addresses are reserved for servers and network devices, while dynamic IP addresses are reserved for clients. But there are certain situations where this might not be true. Moving on to IP datagram. So what is IP datagram? IP datagram is highly structured series of fields that are strictly defined. The two primary sections of a datagram are header and the payload section. More about IP datagram you can find in the description. Okay, so moving on to next, that is versions of IP. There are two versions of IP, that is IPv4 and IPv6. The most common version of IP is IPv4. Version 6 or IPv6 is rapidly seeing more widespread adoption. IPv4 looks like this displayed address format, which has four numbers that can be formed from 0 to 2255, and they're divided by dots. The, it looks massive, but think about how many devices are connected. Yes, there are already more, and the internet service provider need to reuse their available IPs. Some are running out of numbers already, and they are starting to provide IPv6 addresses. In contrast to the IPv4, which uses the 32-bit addressing, the newer version, that is IPv6, uses 128-bit addressing. To see the difference, we will start with one of the example of IPv6. IPv6 has 8 groups, double the number of previous. Each group has 4 hexadecimal digits and the groups are separated by colons. As you can see, there are more combination of available IP addresses. Another benefit of the new protocol is the increased security. It has IPsec, that is Internet Security Protocol. It authenticates the sender and encrypts the data. Okay, moving on to the last concept, that is the IP address classes. An IP address can be split into two sections, the network ID and the host ID. Earlier we mentioned that IBM owns all the IP address that has 9 as the value of the first octet in an IP address. If we take example of IP addresses that is 9.100.100.100, then network will be the first ID and the rest 3 ID will be the host ID. There are IP address can be split into 3 classes, that is class A, class B, class C. The network in class A, the first will be the network ID and the rest 3 divisions will be the host ID. In class B, first and second is the network ID, third and fourth is the host ID. In class C, first, second, third will be the network ID and fourth will be the host ID. In the next upcoming video, we'll see more about subnet and ARP. So see you there.